There are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. But there are also unknown knowns. The ancient and esoteric order of the Jackalope is devoted to unearthing and sharing this knowledge in podcast form. Each episode, we take some piece of miscellaneous esoterica that has slipped through the cracks of common knowledge and share it to you in an easily digestible format. No topic is off limits, except for the obvious. Hey there, Lodge members. We hope you've been having happy holidays and are enjoying this week between. We'd like to help you through to the new year with a story that speaks to the things that, well, speak to us all during this darkest time of the year. Mostly, bank robbery. The Terror of Gillikin Country, presented by Number 13. On Friday, March 11th, 1927, a Brinks armored truck and its escort vehicle made their way through the South Hills of Pittsburgh. They were carrying the payroll for the Pittsburgh Terminal Coal Company's Coverdale mine. The convoy turned off Library Road onto an extension that went to the mine. Suddenly, a tremendous explosion went off beneath the armored truck. It was hurled 75 feet through the air and came to rest upside down with the rear doors blown clean off. Another explosion went off in front of the escort vehicle, which drove right into the 4-foot-deep crater it created and could not drive out. As the dazed and injured guards struggled to get their bearings, 6 armed men wearing flat cats and jumpsuits emerged from the woods. The robbers relieved their victims of weapons, mostly pistols and shotguns, but also a machine gun that had been on hand in case of an assault just like this. One of the bandits, a cruel-looking thug with a broken nose, taunted the injured men with his pistol and announced he was entertaining a notion to bump them off just for fun. Then, the bandits turned their attention to the loot. They tore open the mangled doors of the armored truck and stripped its contents with surprising efficiency. A few minutes later, the robbers were speeding away in their getaway car, having stolen the strangely precise sum of $103,834.38. It was the Great Coverdale Payroll Robbery, the first successful armored truck robbery in history. Just to be clear, armored trucks had been robbed plenty of times. The novelty of the Coverdale robbery was that the crooks struck while the cash was still in transit, instead of just jumping the guards after they'd started to unload their cargo. Anyway, the injured guards limped onward to the Coverdale mine. While they were loaded into cars and rushed to nearby St. Joseph's Hospital, the mine manager started frantically calling the city for help. To no avail. The telephone lines running to the mine had been knocked down by the explosions. When the cops eventually did arrive, the robbers' trail was cold as ice. Didn't matter much. The cops already knew who was responsible. The Torso Burchianti Gang. The Burchianti Gang had been terrorizing the Monongahela Valley since 1921. They specialized in industrial payroll robbery. The bigger the payroll, the better. Their jobs were incredibly risky, but the huge payoffs meant the gang could lay low for months as they made their next plans. The gang members were all experts in their various fields: safecrackers, sharpshooters, demolition experts, and getaway drivers. Tony Torso Burchianti was the de facto leader, not because he was smart or cunning, but because he was reckless and ruthless. His attitude set the tone for the gang. They never hesitated to shoot a resisting victim, an interfering security guard, or even an innocent bystander who happened to get a glimpse of a gang member's face. Collateral damage and the loss of innocent lives didn't bother them in the least. Reckless and ruthless they may have been, but the Burchiantis were also professionals. You had to catch them red-handed, because otherwise they always seemed to have airtight alibis. If you did catch one, he'd be cool as a cucumber under interrogation and never give up his accomplices. The cops weren't sure who made up the gang these days. A life of crime is usually a short one, and the original 6 members of the gang were long gone. Jack Stummy had been shot by the cops during a caper. Pete Fallier, Hugo Fiati, Pete Sabry, and John Torty had gone to the electric chair. Torso had been the last to go, and true to his nature, it was spectacular. In 1924, the gang had planned an ambitious robbery, the $500,000 payroll of the Carnegie Steel Company's Clairton Mills. It was a simple plan: kill everyone in the passenger car of the train the payroll was being transported on, and throw the steel safe off the side. But when the gang boarded the train on Pittsburgh's south side, they realized it was packed full of cops and security guards. Clearly, their inside man had flipped on them. They called an audible and got off at the next stop. But no one could get word to Torso, who was idling further down the line in his getaway vehicle. He sped away when the guards started to disembark and was caught after a thrilling high-speed chase. Shortly afterward, he was convicted of felony murder in an unrelated crime and sentenced to fry. He went to the chair on June 1st, 1925, chomping a cigar and calling the warden every Italian vulgarity he could think of. Torso's gang soldiered on without him. They'd pulled several other jobs in the years since, and the Coverdale robbery showed all the signs of a typical Burchianti caper. The demolition equipment used in the heist had been stolen a few days previously from a PTC mine in nearby Mollenauer. The crooks had spent hours digging up asphalt, planting their homemade charges, and then meticulously patching the road so no one would notice the work. They left inconspicuous piles of newspaper on the side of the road to help them work out their timing, and they'd cut the telephone wires to slow the inevitable call to the cops. That last one had been unnecessary, as it turned out, but still, the sign of a professional job. The crooks had a sizable head start. By now they could be halfway to Buffalo or Detroit, preparing to cross the border into Canada. The cops had virtually nothing to go on. Known gang associates like Dan Rastelli and John Burchianti were hauled in for questioning, but they were tight-lipped as usual. The only real clue was the model and plate number of the getaway car, a blue Stearns Knight, PA 602595, but even that looked like a dead end. The crooks had switched plates with a different car. But over the weekend, the cops got a lucky break. A woman in rural Washington County told the police she had seen a blue Stearns Knight go up a dead-end street on Ginger Hill, never return. After a quick search, the cops found the getaway vehicle at the bottom of a nearby ravine with a stolen machine gun in the back seat. The bandits had backed it up to a barbed wire fence, pushed it into a ravine, and then erased their tracks. They'd even patched the fence so no one could see where they'd gone off-road. Again, total pros. The cops expanded their search area to include Washington County. It turns out the Stearns Knight had been spotted making trips to a general store in Bentleyville. Some discreet questioning allowed the cops to track it back to a dairy farm owned by one Joe Wikoski. According to neighbors, Wikoski seemed to have an awful lot of money for a man with a failing dairy farm. Recently, he'd had visitors and had been driving back and forth from his farm to the city at all hours. That was all the police needed to hear. They surrounded the Wikoski homestead, quietly corralled Joe's wife Sophie and his 6 kids, and surprised 2 men hiding out on the second floor. Stanley Malowski was napping in a cot. Joe Smith was counting a stack of crisp new bills. Smith glanced over at 245 sitting on the table as cops rushed up the stairs, only to think better of it. Then the cops hunkered down and waited for Joe Wikoski to return. They may have been a little too obvious about it. Shortly after dark, a vehicle started to turn up the drive, but the driver spotted the patrol cars hiding out by the house. He quickly backed up and sped down the road. The car was later found abandoned on Pittsburgh's north side. Joe Wikoski may have eluded their dragnet, but the cops were finding plenty of evidence around the farm. There were shotguns and ammunition aplenty. Stolen dynamite and fuses were found hidden in the woodshed. A calendar in the trash had the pay schedules of nearby mines clearly marked. The cops really liked Joe Smith as a suspect. He had a broken nose like the thug who had threatened the Brinks men. The bills he'd been counting had serial numbers that matched the ones stolen in the robbery. Even better, he had a bank passbook in the name of Stanley Stanko with suspicious deposits that lined up with previous Burchianti jobs. Then a Pittsburgh detective identified Smith as Paul Palmer, a 2-bit hood who jumped bail after getting a chest full of buckshot after a failed saloon robbery in Sharpsburg. They aggressively grilled Smith for hours, thinking they could break the dumb hunky, but Smith was a wall. He gave them nothing. Then the cops got a telegram from Detroit. Police there had seen the APB on Smith and identified him as one Paul Jawarski, alias Paul Tops or Paul Poops. Jawarski was wanted for killing a police officer in Hamtramck. The cops showed Smith the telegram, and he broke. He admitted to being Paul Jawarski, and he started to confess everything. Unfortunately for the cops, everything was exactly what the Pennsylvania police didn't want to hear. Paul Pelusinski was born in the Ukraine, but his family emigrated to America when he was still a child. They bounced around the Rust Belt before settling down in Detroit, where they shortened their name to Palace. Even later, Paul would adopt the surname Jawarski to hide his criminal antics from his parents. Paul and his siblings Sam and Lucille witnessed their father's slow, steady decline, brought on by hours of back-breaking labor in the mines and mills. The 3 of them swore that wouldn't happen to them. They would live the easy life and get there the easy way, through crime. They formed their own gang, the Flatheads, named after the flat caps and jumpsuits they wore on the job. The Flatheads first struck on July 15, 1921, when they boarded an interurban streetcar between the Pennsylvania towns of Charleroi and Donora. They forced the driver to stop the car near Eldora Park, and then turn their attention to their real target, 2 employees of the Youghiogheny and Ohio Coal Company carrying the $40,000 payroll for a nearby mine. Naturally, there was resistance, so Paul Jawarski shot one of them in the head. That convinced the other one to give up the goods. The Flatheads cut the power cable for the streetcar and nearby telephone lines, and then fled in a waiting car. The police had nothing to go on. They knew it had to be an inside job because the payroll was about an hour ahead of schedule, but interrogating mine employees proved fruitless. Every other lead proved to be a dead end. In the years to come, this crime would be attributed to the Burchianti Gang. To be fair to the cops, it did fit the Burchianti's MO. The felony murder that sent Torso Burchianti to the chair had been committed during a very similar streetcar robbery. 8 months later, on March 11, 1922, the Flatheads jumped the paymaster of Pittsburgh's Bernard Glockler Company as he returned to his office after a trip to the bank. They relieved the paymaster of his $7,000 burden and hopped into a waiting car. That car was later found abandoned on Stanwyck Street in downtown Pittsburgh, but the Flatheads were long gone. The cops had no other leads. The police later attributed this crime to the Burchianti Gang, mostly because it was a payroll robbery. On December 22, 1922, the Flatheads ambushed a convoy carrying the payroll for the Pittsburgh Coal Company's Harrison Mine. As the convoy made its way down Beadling Road, Paul Jawarski stepped out of the woods with a shotgun and blasted their armed escort, John Ross Dennis, right off his motorcycle. When the dazed Dennis started to reach for his revolver, Jawarski kicked him back to the ground and shot him in the back of the head. Then the Flatheads disabled the rest of the convoy, snagged the $20,000 payroll, and fled in a waiting car. That car was later found abandoned near Charleroi, stripped of any useful evidence. The cops couldn't give up this time, though, since there'd been a murder. A few days later, they rounded up a handful of rough types who'd suddenly come up into money. Thomas Dugan, John Burchianti, Louis Lieri, Orlando Fabri, Frank Rostrelli, and Dan Rostelli. The surviving victims positively identified the 6 men as their attackers, and Rostelli was singled out as the murderer because he had a broken nose, just like Paul Jawarski. Fortunately for these 6 men, the prosecution was a regular comedy of errors. Dugan, Lieri, and Rostrelli had airtight alibis, and all charges against them had to be dropped. The cases against Burchianti and Fabri went to trial, where it turned out they also had excellent alibis, but didn't speak English so good, and had been railroaded by the cops. They were found innocent of all charges. Dan Rostelli was convicted and sentenced to death, but an honest judge threw out all the circumstantial evidence against him and overturned the conviction. The cops fumed at this perceived miscarriage of justice, but there was nothing they could do. This crime, too, was attributed to the Burchianti Gang, mostly because one of the men they had arrested had the not terribly uncommon last name, Burchianti. After the Beadling payroll robbery, Paul Jawarski decided to take it easy for a while. He got married, had a kid, but growing families need money, and Paul Jawarski only knew one way to make money. The People's National Bank of Hamtramck, Michigan was in one of the safest places possible, directly across the street from police headquarters. But police headquarters emptied out on March 4, 1924, when fire alarms went off all across the city. Decoys set off by the Flathead Gang. In the confusion, 3 masked men tried to rob the bank. Things went south real fast. One of the bandits was shot by a teller, who then set off the silent alarm. 2 patrolmen rushed to the scene and fatally wounded the second robber. The sole survivor, Paul Jawarski, was forced to flee empty-handed, and he added yet another line to his rap sheet. During his escape, he shot Sergeant Frank Boza through the neck, killing him instantly. The crime was not attributed to the Burchianti Gang, mostly because it had taken place in Detroit, and Michigan cops didn't seem to have the tunnel vision that the Pennsylvania counterparts had. Just over a month later, on April 30th, Jawarski and an accomplice stormed into a Sharpsburg, Pennsylvania saloon and emptied the register. But when they turned to leave, the bartender called after them, saying that he hadn't given them everything just yet. Curious, Jawarski turned around and received a shotgun blast to the chest at point-blank range. His accomplice fled into the night and was never seen again. The critically injured Jawarski was arrested and rushed to a nearby hospital. It didn't look good, but amazingly he made a recovery. He gave the cops a fake name, Paul Palmer, was charged with attempted robbery, and then, astoundingly, released on $4,000 bail, which he promptly jumped. On August 18th, 3 Flatheads walked into an illegal after-hours bar, a Blind Pig, on West Elizabeth Street in Detroit and started waving their guns around. Unfortunately for them, Detective Frank Haig of the Detroit PD was at that very moment trying to buy a used car from the bartender. Haig drew his service revolver and chased the crooks out of the saloon and down the street. When one of the robbers tripped, Haig stopped to reach for his cuffs. Paul Jawarski took advantage of the opening and shot Haig straight through the heart, killing him instantly. No one attributed these crimes to either the Burchianti or Flathead gangs, because they were small potatoes. On November 11th, Jawarski was hiding out in Chicago with 4 other criminals when the police started firing tear gas through the windows. The men were rounded up and Jawarski was positively identified as Paul Tops, wanted for questioning in the murder of Detective Frank Haig. Jawarski was shipped back to Detroit, questioned, but never charged. All in all, 1924 was a very bad year for Paul Jawarski. He resolved that next year will be very, very different. On November 20th, 1925, 5 flatheads walked into the offices of the Ainsworth Manufacturing Company in Detroit. They forced the employees to be quiet and then ambushed 2 Brinks armored guards as they dropped off the company payroll. The Brinks men put up more of a fight than expected, so the flatheads decided to cut their losses and flee with only a portion of the payroll, which was still a considerable $18,000. Jawarski vented his frustrations during the firefight, killing one of the guards, Ross Loney, with a blast from a sawed-off shotgun. Finally, things were starting to go Paul Jawarski's way, so the Flatheads' next job was even bigger. On December 24th, 1925, a payroll train stopped in Monongahela, PA, loaded down with the payroll and Christmas bonuses for the Pittsburgh Terminal Coal Company's No. 3 mine. As the paymaster and 2 guards carried the money away from the train, the Flatheads burst on the scene in a speeding car and began firing wildly. One of the guards, Isaiah L. Gump, was shot in the stomach and bled to death. The other guards were quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers, and the bandits fled with the entire $48,000 payroll. Police were on the scene almost immediately, and they knew just who to arrest: Dan Rastelli and John Burchianti, who lived nearby. The 2 men may have gotten a pass for the Beadling robbery, but the cops knew guilty when they saw it. But once again, Rastelli and Burchianti proved to have ironclad alibis, as did every other Burchianti associate the cops called in for questioning. Sam Avola, Frank Feeney, Harry Lagos, Robert Nichols, Nick Silver, Dominic Simone, and Italian Joe Zardinelli were all clean as a whistle. Suspiciously so. Damn, those Burchiantis were slick. Meanwhile, the Flatheads were laughing all the way to the bank, just as they had for years. Well, not all of them. Flathead Jack Wright started grumbling to Paul about his share of the loot, so Jawarski addressed his grievances like a true leader. He shot Wright and dumped his body somewhere it couldn't be found. Here's a bizarre sidebar to the Monongahela robbery. The Flatheads had to steal 2 getaway vehicles. First, they stole a car off the street in East Liberty, but it turned out to belong to Secretary of the Treasury Andrew W. Mellon. That was too hot even for the Flatheads, and they abandoned the car on Cherry Way downtown. And that brings us back to the present, March 1927. Paul Jawarski confessed all of these crimes as he led the cops to $33,061 hidden in a milk can, buried in a manure pile, under a cherry tree on the Wachowski farm. Needless to say, the Pennsylvania cops were not happy. Their tunnel vision had allowed the Flathead Gang to operate for years because they'd been ascribing all of their crimes to the Burchianti Gang just because they had a similar modus operandi. All that time and money wasted running down Burchianti associates and harassing poor, innocent Dan Rastelli. It made the cops look like fools. It was a small consolation that this time at least they'd caught the right person. For a while, Jawarski seemed to cooperate. He gave the cops info on Wachowski in the name of 4 other Confederates. Names that later turned out to be fake, but hey. He pled guilty, sparing the state the expense of a trial. And he was even willing to plead guilty to the Beadling and Monongahela holdups, but only under the condition that he be executed as soon as possible. That set off alarm bells. Prosecutors rejected the deal, rightly suspecting that Jawarski was trying to silence himself so he couldn't be milked for more information. So they convicted him the old-fashioned way and left him to rot in the Allegheny County Jail, waiting for the governor to sign his death warrant. On August 18, 1927, Paul got a surprise visitor in prison, his brother, Sam Pallas. They had a short chat in the visitor's room, and then Sam rushed the guards and somehow managed to get 2 .45 caliber automatics to his brother. Paul took one for himself and threw one to his cellmate, John Vassbinder, a drug-crazed psycho who had shot a man in McKeesport for not giving him a quarter. The 3 men then shot their way out of the prison, wounding 2 guards, and into a waiting car driven by an unknown woman. Another first for Paul, the first successful escape from the Allegheny County Jail that wasn't an inside job. Sam was picked up in Hamtramck at the end of September and sent to jail for organizing the breakout. Paul's sister Louise was also pulled in for questioning, since she was suspected of being the getaway driver, but the cops couldn't make anything stick. Paul remained at large. On June 6, 1928, he struck again. 5 Flatheads burst into the office of the Detroit News in the middle of the morning, threatening the employees and looting the paper's $18,000 payroll. Then they shot their way through 2 policemen, one of whom, George Barstad, died, and then started a high-speed chase and run-and-gun battle through the streets of downtown Detroit, before escaping in the general direction of Ohio. It sure looked like Paul Jawarski was back, and thinking bigger than ever. but he screwed up. On September 13, 1928, he was dining out in the open in a Cleveland eatery when one of the other patrons recognized him. They had sung together in a church choir as kids. Soon, the cops were on the scene, only to be greeted by shots from Jawarski's gun. He killed patrolman Anthony Wiskorek, wounded patrolman George Effinger, and then ran out the back door, shooting a bystander in the groin for good measure. He fled through back alleys with the cops in close pursuit before barricading himself in a residence on Chambers Avenue. The cops flushed him out with tear gas and then blasted him with a shotgun as he stumbled out the front door. Jawarski begged for the cops to finish him off, but they were determined to see justice done. They drove him to the hospital in an armored car, surrounded by cops with machine guns and tear gas. Paul laughed at the sight and taunted them. "Ain't you glad I got out of jail? Look at the trip you get." As he recovered from his wounds, he confessed to even more crimes, claiming to have killed 26 men, including John Vassbinder and several other wanted criminals. The cops could only verify 10 of these kills. They thought the others were a trick to stop them from searching for Flathead associates. Rather than waste money on a trial, Ohio extradited Jawarski back to Pennsylvania on the condition that they execute him right away. On January 21, 1929, he went to the electric chair in Rockview Prison. He tried to go out like Torso Burchianti with a cigar in his mouth, but the warden refused. Shortly before his execution, Paul Jawarski sent the district attorney one final message containing a few more confessions to miscellaneous crimes. He signed it off in the most badass way possible. See you at 49 Hellsfire Road, 10 miles beyond hell. This was a fun story to pull together, mostly from contemporary newspaper reporting. There are a number of books that mention the Flathead robbery, usually crazy things that happened in Pennsylvania sort of deal, but most of them get a lot of the key aspects of the crime wrong and confuse the Flathead Gang with the Burchianti Gang just the way the cops did. So I can't really recommend them. We do have one connection to a previous story. Paul Jawarski spent his final days stewing in Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary. As he was being transferred to Rockville for his execution, another prisoner was being transferred in, John Blymeyer, the York County hex murderer. We talked about that strange tale of murder and magic in our Halloween episode, Series 5's Bound in Mystery and Shadow. And that's it for now. We'll be back in 2 weeks with an episode we're calling The Prophet of the Pacific. Until then, Quiquid minimi sciunt, optime scire. This podcast was produced by David White for the Ancient and Esoteric Order of the Jackalope. It is released under a Creative Commons 4.0 Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. All rights reserved, all wrongs reversed. The script of this episode, with sources, links, and more, can be found on our website at orderthejackalope.com. That's orderthejackalope.com with hyphens between the words. Keep up with our latest updates on social media at Order Jackalope on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Reddit, or contact us via email at jackalope@orderthejackalope.com. Want to join the fastest growing secret society in the nation? We'll show you our hidden secrets if you show us yours first. Visit our website and click Join Us for more information.